Hello everybody, Kyle O here. In my previous VHS update, I actually left out a couple of titles. Well, actually one, but I figured I'd show it, and I'd also show a couple of other VHS tapes I got last year that aren't Disney VHS tapes. Kind of doing something a little bit different here. And I also figured I'd show a couple of Disney VHS tapes in full detail that I've never shown before. Back in 2016, I got two Japanese Disney VHS tapes, and in early 2017, I got an Italian Disney VHS tape. So I never showed those in full detail because I planned on doing video corner episodes of those, but those plans fell to the wayside. So I'm just going to show them in full detail in this video because I've had a little bit more time to actually film YouTube videos, what with COVID-19 and all, and the fact that we all have to stay home. So the first VHS that I want to show is one that I got back in autumn, I believe, autumn of last year, and that would be the 1985 VHS of Dumbo, the first Classics edition. This is actually, if you know me very well, if you've been following me for years and years and years, you'll know that I've already had this edition in my collection. However, the edition that I've had since October of 2006 has a faded cover. It was a former rental, and it was probably sitting on a store shelf facing the sun for about 20 years until I got my hands on it. And ever since I got that VHS tape, I got a couple of Betamax versions of this edition that had cover artwork that wasn't faded, it wasn't sun-paled. For years I held off on getting a VHS copy until now, and I'm going to show you, that's the one I've had since 2006, just showing you how badly faded the cover is in comparison. I plan to hold on to the one that I got back in 2006 though, because it holds a little bit of sentimental value to me. I started collecting Disney VHS tapes in 2005, working off of what I already had, what I'd already built up since the early 90s as a kid, and I got the 1985 VHS of Dumbo in fall 2006, as I had said previously, and collecting those Disney VHS tapes was kind of a bright spot in what was rather a rough time in my life, so I want to hold on to that printing of Dumbo. The other reason I want to hold on to it is because this January 1986 printing doesn't have the MPAA rating card, nor does it have the Buena Vista logo. The film starts with the credits, so that music, the overture, just abruptly cuts in without those first 4 or 5 bars of music that you hear over the Buena Vista logo or the RKO logo. Moving on, this is the Italian VHS of Lady and the Tramp. Unfortunately, there were no Italian-American Disney VHS releases. Here in the United States, you could get Disney VHS tapes in Espanol and Francaise, but no Italian-American options. This is the Italian VHS release of Lady and the Tramp. It is from 1990. In fact, it even says on the back, it's from Ottobre 1990. Ottobre, of course, Italian for October. Obviously. Lady and the Tramp is fitting to me because, Tony and Joe, they're Italian-Americans. I associate Italy with, romance and romantic. I myself am half Italian, so I don't sound it, but I am. I wanted to get Pinocchio, but, because Pinocchio being based on an Italian fairy tale, but these tapes are very hard to come across, if you're in America and you're looking for these things on eBay, but Lady and the Tramp popped up, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to get this. I already had the French one, La Belle et les Clochard. I felt, you know what, I'm going to get Italian one as well. It uses the same cover artwork, of course, as all the other releases and the 1987 North American release. And 1990 was when Lady and the Tramp came out on VHS in Europe. I think some actually came out in 1991, but most of them were released around fall 1990. The UK release, this Italian release, the French release, and presumably all the other European releases. Now, interestingly, the majority of the European releases of Lady and the Tramp have the 1989 Walt Disney Classics logo before the start of the movie. This is unusual because the Classics logo, as I explained in one of my older videos, was barely ever used outside of North America. And when I say North America, I specifically mean the United States and Canada. The Classics logo, to my knowledge, has never been used in Mexico or any Central American territories, and if it ever showed up internationally, it was often by accident. Such is the case with the Italian VHS of Lady and the Tramp from 1990 and several other European releases of Lady and the Tramp from around this time period. This is true of, out of all the ones I've seen, the French VHS, which is where I discovered that for the first time, along with the Finnish VHS, and supposedly the Greek VHS. If I'm leaving out any, please let me know. In Italian, Lady and the Tramp is known as Lili e il Vagabondo, and some Italian Disney VHS tapes use the Classics logo on the spine under the name Grandi Classici. This is also the case for their release of Pinocchio, which I believe is from 1987 or 1988. Of course, it uses the same cover artwork as the 85 one, so there are a couple of Italian VHS releases that have this diamond on the spine, and as far as I know, Lady and the Tramp is the only Italian release to have the Classics logo, animated intro, before the start of the movie. Alright, so here is the Japanese VHS of Aladdin. This is, of course, the original Japanese VHS release. It's from around 1994. The cover artwork uses one of John Alvin's alternate posters for the film. John Alvin was designing the posters for Disney's animated classics around this time. He did a couple of posters for Aladdin, along with a couple of posters for Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King. Japanese Disney VHS releases came in 3 different editions. There'd be the Japanese language version, there'd be an English language version with Japanese subtitles, which this Aladdin VHS is. You can tell by the green triangle up in the corner. And the yellow ones, as you might have seen in my previous video, are for bilingual releases, both English and Japanese. From what I can see, the English language, Japanese subtitle VHS releases of Disney animated films used cover artwork that was unique to those releases, and oftentimes they used a theatrical release poster and not cover artwork meant for home video releases. This Japanese VHS of Aladdin also ends with a music video that's the Peabo Bryson and Regina Bell version of A Whole New World, which is the pop version for the credits and, for the single and such. It's a live-action music video, and it appears after the credits finish rolling in the movie. It's a neat little bonus, and in the early to mid-90s, Disney VHS tapes didn't really have such bonuses back in the day. It wouldn't be until around the late 90s when they started putting little goodies at the end of the VHS tapes. Stuff that you could probably only get on the Laserdisc, the deluxe Laserdisc bonus features. But not everybody had a Laserdisc player back then, so tough luck. And here we have another Japanese Disney VHS release. This is for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This is in Japanese language. No English subtitles, just completely in Japanese. And this cover artwork is also unique to this release because I don't think I've seen that cover used on any other VHS release or Laserdisc release of Snow White in any Western territory. Certainly not here, and certainly not in the UK. I actually haven't made it to the end of this tape yet. One day I'm going to watch the whole film in Japanese. I just haven't had the time to watch everything on hand. But there might be like a behind-the-scenes special at the end, just like there was on the UK VHS. Anyways, I got this in the Aladdin Japanese VHS back in 2016, and I never properly showed them, so I figured I'd show them in this update video. The interesting thing about the Japanese VHS tapes is that there'd be a label on the main, like in the center of the VHS shell, but there'd also be one on the bottom. Some other movie companies did that here in the States. Disney, not so much, which is really strange. That's where the print date and such would be. And these cases are really cool because they're made of a very durable plastic, unlike the very soft and fragile plastic used for our clamshell cases. It's almost like a rental box. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears here. We're going to go from Disney to the Beatles. In my years of VHS collecting, I never really went after non-Disney titles, but for the first time, last summer, I got a couple of Beatles VHS tapes. I want to show them to you. The Beatles are one of my all-time favorite bands. If you've been subscribed to me for a long while, you've probably seen my record collection videos. The Beatles and Disney almost came together a couple of times. Walt Disney had asked for the Beatles to voice the Vultures in The Jungle Book. John Lennon angrily denied his request. So Walt Disney ended up advising the crew on The Jungle Book to give the Vultures a barbershop quartet song. However, they still casted Chad Stewart from the British invasion folk duo Chad and Jeremy to play Flaps. You know, hey, now don't start that again. The other time where Disney and the Beatles almost crossed over was when Robert Zemeckis was going to direct a motion capture remake of Yellow Submarine, and Disney was going to release that film in the summer of 2012. However, that all fell through after Zemeckis' Image Movers company delivered the film Mars Needs Moms to Disney, which bombed horribly at the box office in early 2011. That scuttled any plans of Disney releasing a Yellow Submarine remake. But yeah, those are like the two instances in history where Disney and the Beatles nearly crossed over. There were also other tiny little Disney Beatle connections. John Lennon had stated that the song Do You Want to Know a Secret, which appeared on the Beatles' first album, Please Please Me, was based on the Wishing Well song from Snow White. There's probably more out there that I don't quite remember off the top of my head. Paul McCartney, Bambi had a huge impact on Paul McCartney when he was young, and that's why he's an animal rights person. Well, yeah, enough of that though. Let's talk about the Beatles VHS tapes that I have. Here is I presume, the first VHS release of the Beatles' Help. This came out in 1987. It was on MPI Home Video. The cover is interesting in that the credits are on the front rather than the back, also touting that hi-fi digital audio. Big thing back in the mid to late 80s for sure. Of course, it comes in a standard slip case, and the typography for the Help logo resembles that of the typography used for the US Capitol Records album cover and not the original British one on Parlophone. It has a preview for A Hard Day's Night before the start of the movie, and the unique thing about that is they used the original theatrical trailer for A Hard Day's Night, not an actual, coming to video preview. They used the actual original theatrical trailer from 1964. So that's a nice little piece of history before the movie. It's a standard vertical label there. Not much else to say other than Help is actually a really fun movie. And like most of the Beatles movies, it's a real delight, much like A Hard Day's Night before it. And here we have Yellow Submarine. This is the first VHS release of the film, which also came out in 1987. This also has credits on the front, much like the Help VHS cover, but it's on MGM United Artists Home Video, not MPI. The interesting thing about the original video release of Yellow Submarine is that it contains what is known as the North American cut of the movie. There are two cuts of Yellow Submarine. There's the original cut, which was what British audiences saw in July of 1968, and the North American cut. Al Brodax, the producer of Yellow Submarine, was unhappy with one sequence in the original cut of the film, a sequence that was hastily put together after the filmmakers had heard the song that it was based on. That was Hey Bulldog. Hey Bulldog's sequence, which you could tell was kind of rushed and put together at last minute, was cut from the movie after it premiered in England. Internationally, audiences saw a version that had a different sequence bridging the gap. That's the cut of the film that you'll see on this VHS release. Ever since the 1999 DVD and VHS release of Yellow Submarine, this cut has never been released again. Next up, we have a VHS of Magical Mystery Tour, which was the Beatles' only television film. This was released by Media Home Entertainment, and the case is unusual in that you can't just slide the VHS tape out. There's a bottom flap that you have to open in order to get the VHS tape out. It's unusual. I've never really seen a cardboard slipcover case like that. The cover artwork for this tape was produced in 1981, and it even says that on the copyright date on the back cover. However, the tape label says copyright 1984, so I assume that they just used an old cover. They just used the older cover, and the tape inside was like a reissue or an updated print, similar to what Disney did with the '89 era releases of Dumbo, Alice in Wonderland, and Sword in the Stone. This VHS of Magical Mystery Tour contains a very poor quality print of the film. It looks like a bootleg, actually. The sound quality is very, very low, and the image is really, really grainy. It feels like you're watching a bootleg of Magical Mystery Tour, which it might as well have been. Because Magical Mystery Tour was aired on the BBC on Boxing Day in 1967, and then it was aired a second time after that in color. However, the staggeringly poor reception of the film convinced ABC to not air the special here in the United States in early 1968. They had been planning on doing so. Magical Mystery Tour ended up being shown in midnight theaters in the mid-1970s, and it's presumed that this VHS was sourced from one of those film prints and not the original master, wherever that may have been at the time. A few years later, Apple released a cleaner version of Magical Mystery Tour with better audio in 1988. I never owned that VHS. I borrowed it once. That was actually the first time I had ever seen Magical Mystery Tour. So this earlier release is an interesting relic in that it's basically a legitimate bootleg of the film. Next up, we have the Beatles Live Ready Steady Go Special Edition. This is a Sony Video 45 release, as you can see there from the top of the cover, and it's a video compilation of live performances from around 1964. I don't think this was ever released again on VHS or DVD. It sports some pretty neat artwork and neat typography, which gives off a real 1964 vibe. And there you got the hi-fi thing again. It came out in 1985, and as it says on the back there, recorded live in 1964, and it's all in black and white. The footage quality, however, is fantastic, and I like how the back of the box mentions that all you need is love is an end captions music only, and it's like it's over the end credits, basically, and it's just part of the song, it's not the whole song. But yes, it is a really cool release, even though it only runs about 20 minutes. It's a rare look at the Beatles live before, like the anthology series came out and before other various DVDs and, home video releases showing the Beatles live in 64 and 65. Like, it's one of those, it even touts, these are recordings you've never heard elsewhere, like they weren't released on record or anything like that. So it's definitely worth having. Lastly, we have Fun with the Fab Four, as the cover touts, a documentary of the sensational 60s. It's basically a compilation of interviews and footage all surrounding the Beatles, mainly the 64-65 period and Beatlemania. There's actually a lot of stuff on here that I hadn't seen before. Some interviews that are really, really cool, and it looked like there was even some outtake footage from A Hard Day's Night. The audio quality is very, very, despite what that disclaimer says on the back, the audio quality is very all over the place. Sometimes I couldn't make out what they were saying, and sometimes it was a little clearer. But considering that this was 1986, and this is public domain footage we're talking here, it's very possible that Good Times simply just didn't have the resources available to them to clean up the audio or make it a little clearer. It's just what they had, and they made do with it. Now, here's the most dubious thing about this VHS. This is a recordable VHS tape. Recordable. I mean, I know that Good Times wasn't exactly a renowned video distributor. In the late 80s, early 90s, they were infamous for releasing a lot of sort of knockoff animated titles to cash in on Disney animated features and sort of fool the unsuspecting grannies at the dollar stores. But this is off the mark. Though what ultimately matters is the footage on the tape is really, really cool, and there's about 50 or so minutes of it, so that's a real treat. And even though the audio quality is on and off from time to time, it's still very much worth a watch. And I doubt it was an authorized release in any way, shape, or form, hence it being a Good Times release. It was probably public domain interview footage that was okay for them to use, because, like I said, I'd seen some of that footage before on, like, TV specials and such that were uploaded to YouTube. Good stuff.